In 1982, a 29-year-old ballet instructor named Sylvia Hart vanished without a trace from the Green Hill Theater during what should have been routine final rehearsals for a touring production. The accomplished dancer, known for her meticulous attention to detail and unwavering dedication to her students, simply disappeared between the evening's dress rehearsal and the company's scheduled departure the following morning. Her absence was noted when the company bus prepared to leave for their next venue. But by then, Sylvia Hart had already become a ghost. But 20 years later, during renovations of the aging theater, workers would make a discovery that would shatter every assumption about her disappearance and reveal a truth so disturbing that it would forever change how the dance community understood the price of silence. The investigation that followed would uncover not just the fate of a missing woman, but a web of exploitation, power, and the devastating consequences of speaking truth to authority in a world where artistic dreams could be weaponized. Against the most vulnerable dot, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sylvia Hart had arrived at the Green Hill Theater in March of 1982 as part of the Northeast Regional Ballet Company's spring tours. The company, under the direction of Marcus Kellerman, was considered one of the more prestigious regional troupes, known for taking promising young dancers and molding them into potential candidates for major ballet companies. Kellerman himself was a former principal dancer with the American Ballet Theater. His reputation built on both his technical excellence and his ability to identify and nurture raw talent. The theater itself was a modest venue in a small Massachusetts town, the kind of place where touring companies would perform for audiences hungry for culture beyond their usual fare. Built in the 1920s, the Green Hill had seen better days by 1982, but it maintained a certain dignity with its ornate proscenium arch and red velvet seats that had witnessed decades of performances. Sylvia was not a principal dancer with the company, but rather served as both a corps member and an instructor for the younger dancers who traveled with the troupe. At 29, she was older than most of the performers, having started her professional career later than typical after completing a degree in dance education. Her role was unique within the company structure, part mentor, part teacher, part performer. Bridging the gap between Kellerman's often harsh directorial style and the needs of dancers who were still learning their craft. Those who knew, Sylvia described her as quietly intense, someone who took her responsibilities seriously, particularly when it came to the younger members of the company. She had a reputation for staying late after rehearsals, working with struggling dancers on their technique, offering encouragement when Kellerman's criticism became particularly sharp. In a world where competition was fierce and kindness could be seen as weakness, Sylvia carved out a space for compassion. The company had been on the road for 6 weeks when they arrived in Green Hill, performing in small theaters throughout New England. The tour was considered a success, with positive reviews and strong attendance. But those close to the production noted increasing tension within the company as the weeks progressed. Kellerman, always demanding, seemed to be pushing the dancers harder than usual. His criticism more cutting, his expectations more unrealistic. Several of the younger dancers, particularly the teenage members of the company, appeared increasingly withdrawn as the tour continued in the insular world of a traveling ballet company, where days were spent in cramped rehearsal spaces and evenings in modest hotels. Tensions had a way of amplifying. What might have been manageable conflicts in a stable environment became magnified under the pressure of constant performance and travel. The final rehearsal at the Green Hill Theater on March 15, 1982, was described by those present as particularly intense. The company was preparing for what would be their final performance before a brief break, after which they would regroup for a summer engagement. Kellerman seemed agitated throughout the evening, stopping and restarting sequences repeatedly, his voice echoing through the empty theater as he berated dancers for what he perceived as lack of focus. Sylvia was last seen by her roommate, another company member named Patricia Lowe, at approximately 10:30 p.m. that evening. Patricia later told investigators that Sylvia had seemed upset about something, but wouldn't say what was bothering her. When Patricia suggested they return to their hotel together, Sylvia declined, saying she needed to take care of something at the theater first. She had this look, Patricia would later recall. Like she was carrying something heavy, something she didn't want to talk about. I should have insisted on staying with her, but we were all so tired from the tour, and honestly, I just wanted to get back to the hotel and sleep. The next morning, when the company gathered for their departure, Sylvia was nowhere to be found. Her belongings remained in her hotel room, her costume from the previous evening's rehearsal still hanging in the theater's dressing room. Most troubling of all, her street clothes and purse were discovered in her assigned dressing area, suggesting she had never changed after the rehearsal ended. Kellerman's initial reaction to Sylvia's absence was dismissive. He told the other company members that she had probably met someone and decided to extend her stay in the area, a suggestion that those who knew Sylvia found completely out of character. When pressed by Patricia and others to contact local authorities, Kellerman reluctantly agreed, but made it clear he considered the matter a personal issue rather than a company concern. The initial police investigation was perfunctory at best. Officer Daniel Morrison, who took the initial report, later admitted that the case was treated as a likely voluntary disappearance from the beginning. A young woman in the arts, traveling with a performance company, the assumption was that she had simply decided to leave the company and start fresh somewhere else. "We see it more often than you'd think," Morrison would say years later. People in theater, in dance, they're often running from something or looking for something different. The fact that she left her things behind, well, sometimes people want to make a clean break. The investigation consisted primarily of interviews with company members, all of whom were eager to continue their tours and leave the incident behind them. Kellerman was questioned briefly and expressed concern for Sylvia's well-being, while maintaining that he had no idea where she might have gone or why she would leave so suddenly. Several company members mentioned that Sylvia had seemed troubled in the days leading up to her disappearance, but none could provide specific details about what might have been bothering her. The younger dancers, in particular, seemed reluctant to discuss the matter at all, responding to questions with brief, rehearsed-sounding answers that provided little useful information. Within a week, the case had been filed away as a probable voluntary disappearance. The company completed their tours. Kellerman hired a replacement instructor, and life moved on. Sylvia Hart became another name in a file cabinet, another person who had simply vanished into the larger world, leaving behind only questions and the gradually fading memories of those who had known her. Sylvia's family, however, refused to accept the official explanation. Her sister, Margaret Hart Wilson, drove up from Connecticut the moment she learned of the disappearance and spent days searching the area around the theater, posting flyers and pressing local authorities to expand their investigation. Margaret knew her sister better than anyone, and the idea that Sylvia would simply abandon her career and disappear without a word was inconceivable. Sylvia was methodical, responsible, someone who planned every aspect of her life carefully. Even if she had decided to leave the company, she would have given notice, arranged for her replacement, and certainly would have contacted her family. Sylvia wasn't impulsive, Margaret would later say. She didn't make sudden decisions, especially ones that would hurt other people. She cared too much about those young dancers to just walk away without making sure they were okay. Margaret's investigation uncovered details that the police had overlooked or dismissed. She learned that Sylvia had made several phone calls in the days before her disappearance, including one to a social services office in Boston. When Margaret tried to follow up on this lead, she was told that the records were confidential and couldn't be discussed. More troubling still, Margaret discovered that several of the younger company members had left the troupe shortly after the incident, citing personal reasons or family obligations. When she tried to contact them directly, most were reluctant to discuss their time with the company or the circumstances surrounding Sylvia's disappearance. One former dancer, speaking on condition of anonymity, told Margaret that there had been problems within the company but wouldn't elaborate on what those problems might have been. The conversation ended abruptly when Margaret pressed for more details, and the young woman refused to take her calls after that. Despite Margaret's efforts, the case remained officially closed as a voluntary disappearance. The family hired a private investigator, but after months of work, he was unable to uncover any new leads. Gradually, as hope faded and resources were exhausted, the active search for Sylvia Hart came to an end. The years passed, and the Northeast Regional Ballet Company continued to tours, though it never again achieved the level of success it had enjoyed in 1982. Kellerman remained as artistic director, building a reputation for his ability to train young dancers. Though some whispered that his methods were controversial and his behavior toward his students inappropriate. The Greenhill Theatre continued to host touring productions, though by the 1990s it was showing serious signs of age. The building's infrastructure was deteriorating, and there were increasing concerns about safety and accessibility. By 2002, 20 years after Sylvia's disappearance, the theater's board of directors made the difficult decision to undertake a major renovation, or face permanent closure. The renovation project began in earnest in the summer of 2002, with plans to update the building's electrical and plumbing systems, restore the original architectural details, and modernize the backstage areas. The work was extensive, requiring the removal of decades of modifications and additions that had accumulated over the years. It was during this renovation that workers began to examine the theater's dressing room areas more closely. The backstage spaces had been modified numerous times over the decades, with walls moved, mirrors relocated, and storage areas reconfigured to meet the changing needs of different productions and companies. The discovery came in late August, during what should have been routine work in the largest dressing room, the one typically used by featured performers and company principals. Workers had noticed that one section of wall seemed to have been added later than the original construction, and when they began to remove it to access electrical wiring behind it, they found something that would change everything. The wall had been constructed hastily, clearly not by professional craftsmen, and when it was removed, workers found a small space behind the dressing room's main mirror. The space was barely large enough for a person to fit inside, and it had clearly been sealed up quickly and recently, relative to the building's age. What they found in that space would finally answer the question of what had happened to Sylvia Hart on that March night in 1982, and would reveal a truth so shocking that it would reverberate through the dance community for years to come. But to understand the full significance of that discovery, it's necessary to examine what had been happening within the Northeast Regional Ballet Company in the months and years before Sylvia's disappearance, and the culture of silence and fear that had allowed certain behaviors to continue unchecked. The world of professional dance, particularly ballet, has always been one where young performers are especially vulnerable. The demands of the art form require dancers to begin serious training at very young ages, often moving away from home as teenagers to study with respected teachers or join pre-professional companies. This separation from family and normal support systems creates an environment where authority figures can wield tremendous influence. Marcus Kellerman understood this dynamic better than most. His own career had been built on identifying young talent and cultivating relationships with dancers who saw him as the key to their future success. Former company members would later describe a complex system of favoritism and punishment that kept dancers competing not just for roles, but for Kellerman's approval and attention. Several dancers who had worked with the company in the late 1970s and early 1980s began to come forward after news of the discovery at the Greenhill Theatre became public. Their accounts painted a picture of an organization where boundaries were routinely crossed and where speaking out about inappropriate behavior was seen as career suicide. Jennifer Morrison, who had been 16 when she joined the company, described an environment where Kellerman regularly made comments about dancers' bodies that went far beyond the technical feedback expected in a professional setting. More troubling still, she alleged that Kellerman had established a pattern of offering additional coaching and opportunities to young female dancers in exchange for what he characterized as special trust and mature understanding. It seemed like it was part of being a professional. Morrison would later testify. Like if you couldn't handle his approach, you weren't serious about your career. He said the major companies expected dancers to be sophisticated, to understand that relationships in the dance world were different from the outside world. Other former dancers corroborated Morrison's account, describing a culture where behavior was an open secret, but where no one felt safe speaking out. The dance world was small. Kellerman was well connected, and challenging him meant risking not just one's position with his company, but potentially one's entire career. This was the environment that Sylvia Hart had entered when she joined the company. It was this environment that she had been observing and documenting in the weeks before her disappearance, according to accounts that would emerge much later. Sylvia had become increasingly concerned about Kellerman's behavior toward The younger dancers in the company, as both a performer and an instructor, she was in a unique position to observe the dynamics within the troupe, and what she saw troubled her deeply. Patricia Lowe, Sylvia's roommate during the tour, would eventually reveal that Sylvia had been keeping detailed notes about incidents she had witnessed or that had been reported to her by younger dancers. These notes, which were never found, apparently documented a pattern of inappropriate behavior that went far beyond the normal demands of professional dance training. She was building a case, Patricia would later explain. She kept saying that someone had to do something, that these kids were being hurt and no one was protecting them. She was terrified of speaking out, but she was more terrified of staying silent. The phone call that Margaret Hart-Wilson had traced to a social services office in Boston was apparently Sylvia's attempt to find out what options were available. For reporting suspected abuse within a professional arts organization, the timing of that call, just 3 days before her disappearance, suggested that she was preparing to take action. Several company members would later admit that they had been aware of Sylvia's concerns and her intention to report Kellerman's behavior, but none had been willing to support her publicly. The culture of silence that protected predators in the arts. The world had proved stronger than their concern for the younger dancers who were being victimized on the night of her disappearance, according to accounts that would eventually emerge. Sylvia had confronted Kellerman directly about what she had observed and documented. The confrontation had taken place after the official rehearsal had ended, when most of the company had returned to their hotel. Witnesses would later describe seeing Kellerman's car in the theater parking lot much later than usual that night, and hearing raised voices from inside the building. But in the immediate aftermath of Sylvia's disappearance, no one connected these observations to her fate. The renovation of the Green Hill Theater in 2002 would finally provide the physical evidence that had been missing from the original investigation. The discovery behind the dressing room mirror was more than just proof that Sylvia Hart had never left the theater that night. It was evidence of a crime that had been covered up for 20 years. But even with this physical evidence, building a case against Kellerman would prove challenging. 20 years had passed, memories had faded, and many of the key witnesses were reluctant to come forward. The dance community's culture of silence, which had protected Kellerman for decades, now threatened to prevent justice for Sylvia Hart. The renewed investigation that followed the discovery at the theater would require not just police work, but a fundamental shift in how the arts community approached issues of abuse and accountability. It would take years to build a case strong enough to hold up in court, and even longer to begin healing the wounds that had been inflicted on multiple generations of young dancers. Detective Sarah Chen, who was assigned to lead the renewed investigation, understood that she was dealing with more than just a 20-year-old cold case. She was confronting a system that had failed to protect vulnerable young people and had allowed a predator to operate with impunity. For decades, Chen's investigation began with a careful examination of the physical evidence discovered during the theater renovation. The condition and placement of what was found behind the mirror provided crucial clues about what had happened on the night of March 15, 1982, and helped establish a timeline for the events that followed. Working with forensic specialists, Chen was able to determine that the wall sealing off the space behind the mirror had been constructed hurriedly, using materials that were readily available in the theater. The construction was amateur, suggesting that it had been done by someone without professional building experience but with immediate access to the theater and its resources. More importantly, the investigation revealed trace evidence that connected the space directly to the events of that March night. Fibers, hair samples, and other microscopic evidence painted a picture of violence and hasty concealment that contradicted every assumption about Sylvia's voluntary disappearance. But physical evidence alone would not be enough to prosecute a case after 20 years. Chen needed witnesses, and she needed victims willing to come forward and testify about what they had experienced within. Kellerman's company, the detective's approach was methodical and patient. She understood that many of the former dancers who had worked with Kellerman were now adults with careers and families of their own. People who had spent years trying to move past their experiences with the company. Convincing them to revisit that trauma and expose themselves to public scrutiny would require building trust. And demonstrating that the justice system was finally ready to take their claims seriously, Chen began by reaching out to dancers who had left the company around the time of Sylvia's disappearance, particularly those who had departed suddenly or under unusual circumstances. Many of these individuals had never been properly interviewed during the original investigation, and their stories revealed a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond what had been documented at the time. One of the first to agree to speak with Chen was David Martinez, who had been 17 when he joined the company in 1981. Martinez had left the troupe just 2 months after Sylvia's disappearance, citing family obligations, but he now revealed that his departure had been precipitated by what he had witnessed on the night she vanished. Martinez told Chen that he had returned to the theater that evening to retrieve some personal items he had forgotten, arriving just as most of the company was leaving for their hotel. He had seen Kellerman's car in the parking lot and heard voices from inside the building, but had decided not to enter, sensing that something private was occurring. "I heard them arguing," Martinez told Chen. Sylvia's voice was really upset, and Kellerman sounded angry, angrier than I'd ever heard him. I was scared, honestly. I'd never heard anyone challenge him like that, and I knew it wasn't going to end well. Martinez had waited in his own car for several minutes, debating whether to go inside or leave. Eventually, he decided to leave, but he continued to watch the theater from a distance. He saw Kellerman's car remain in the parking lot until well after midnight, and observed him making several trips between the building and his vehicle, carrying what appeared to be bags or bundles. "I should have done something," Martinez said, the guilt evident in his voice even 20 years later. "But I was just a kid, and I was terrified of what would happen to me if I got involved. Kellerman controlled everything for us, our careers, our futures. Going against him felt impossible." Martinez's account provided crucial corroboration for the timeline that Chen was constructing, but she needed more. She needed testimony from the dancers who had been directly victimized by Kellerman, the young women whose experiences Sylvia had been trying to document and report. Jennifer Morrison, now a successful dance teacher in California, was one of the first former victims to agree to speak publicly about her experiences with Kellerman. Her decision to come forward opened the floodgates, as other women realized they were not alone in what they had endured. Morrison's testimony was detailed and damning. She described a pattern of grooming that had begun almost immediately after she joined the company, with Kellerman gradually escalating from inappropriate comments to unwanted physical contact to explicit demands. For sexual compliance, in exchange for professional opportunities, he made it seem normal, Morrison explained to Chen, like this was just how things worked in the professional dance world. He said all the major directors expected this kind of relationship with their principal dancers. And if I wanted to succeed, I needed to understand that. Morrison also revealed that she had spoken with Sylvia Hart about Kellerman's behavior in the weeks before the disappearance. Sylvia had been gathering accounts from multiple dancers, trying to build a comprehensive picture of what was happening. Within the company, Sylvia was the first adult who ever believed us, Morrison said. The first person who said that what was happening wasn't okay, that it wasn't just part of the business. She said she was going to make sure it stopped, that she was going to protect us. As more former dancers came forward, a pattern emerged that was even more disturbing than Chen had initially suspected. Kellerman had not just been exploiting individual dancers, he had created a systematic culture of abuse that had continued for years. Young dancers were isolated from their families, made dependent on his approval for their careers, and gradually conditioned to accept increasingly inappropriate behavior. The psychological manipulation was as damaging as the physical abuse. Kellerman had convinced his victims that they were complicit in what was happening, that speaking out would destroy not just their own careers, but the careers of other dancers in the company. He had weaponized their dreams against them, using their passion for dance as a tool of control. Chen's investigation also revealed that Sylvia Hart had not been the only person to attempt to expose Kellerman's behavior over the years. At least 3 other individuals had tried to report concerns to various authorities, but their complaints had been dismissed or ignored. The arts community's culture of protecting prominent figures had effectively shielded Kellerman from accountability. For decades, as the investigation progressed, Chen began to understand the full scope of what Sylvia Hart had discovered and why her decision to speak out had represented such a threat to Kellerman. She had not just been documenting isolated incidents, she had been exposing a systematic pattern of abuse that could have brought down not just Kellerman, but potentially the entire company. The pressure that Kellerman must have felt as Sylvia prepared to go public with her findings would have been enormous. His career, his reputation, and his freedom were all at stake. For someone who had spent decades believing himself untouchable, the prospect of finally being held accountable must have been terrifying. The renewed investigation also revealed troubling questions about the original police response to Sylvia's disappearance. Several former company members reported that they had tried to provide information to investigators at the time but had been dismissed or ignored. The assumption that Sylvia had left voluntarily had colored every aspect of the investigation, preventing authorities from pursuing leads that might have uncovered the truth much earlier. As Chen delved deeper into the case, she began to uncover evidence that suggested Kellerman had not acted entirely alone. Other members of the company's leadership appeared to have been aware of his behavior and had actively worked to conceal it. The culture of silence that had protected Kellerman was not just a product of fear among his victims. It was a systematic effort to maintain the company's reputation and financial viability. This broader conspiracy made prosecuting the case even more complex. Even with the physical evidence from the theater and the testimony of multiple victims, proving what had happened to Sylvia Hart after 20 years remained a significant challenge. Many of the key witnesses were dead, memories had faded, and the legal system was not well equipped to handle cases that involved both historic sexual abuse and murder. Chun's investigation took on a new urgency as she realized that Kellerman, now in his 70s, was still teaching and had access to young dancers. While he had officially retired from the Northeast Regional Ballet Company years earlier, he continued to operate a private studio and work with pre-professional dancers. The possibility that he was still victimizing young people added immediate importance to the case. Working with prosecutors, Chen began building a case that would encompass not just Sylvia's murder, but the broader pattern of abuse that had led to it. The strategy was risky, as it required convincing a jury to understand the complex dynamics of institutional abuse and the courage it had taken for Sylvia to challenge such a powerful figure. The legal team faced significant challenges in preparing the case for trial. Many of the abuse victims were reluctant to testify publicly, fearing the impact on their current lives and careers. The defense would undoubtedly argue that the testimony about historic abuse was prejudicial and irrelevant to the murder charges, and proving what had happened in the theater on the night of March 15, 1982, would require jurors to accept a complex narrative based largely on circumstantial evidence. Despite these challenges, Chen remained determined to seek justice for Sylvia Hart and the young dancers she had tried to protect. The detective understood that this case represented more than just one woman's murder. It was about confronting a culture that had allowed predators to operate with impunity, and victims too suffer in silence. As the investigation neared its conclusion and preparations for trial began, the impact of the case was already being felt throughout the dance community. Studios and companies across the country were implementing new policies and procedures designed to protect young dancers. The conversation about abuse in the arts, long suppressed, was finally beginning to happen in earnest. But for Chen, the most important goal remained unchanged, ensuring that Sylvia Hart's courage in standing up for vulnerable young people was finally recognized, and that her death was not in vain. The detective knew that no legal victory could bring Sylvia back, or undo the trauma that so many dancers had endured. But it could send a message that the culture of silence and impunity was finally coming to an end. The trial of Marcus Kellerman would ultimately become a watershed moment for the arts community, forcing a reckoning with decades of abuse and institutional failures. But the path to that courtroom had been long and difficult, marked by the courage of survivors who chose to speak their truth and the determination of investigators who refused to let a cold case remain cold. As Chen prepared to present her findings to prosecutors, she reflected on the woman whose disappearance had started it all. Sylvia Hart had paid the ultimate price for her decision to protect vulnerable young people. But her courage had ultimately exposed the truth and brought about changes that would protect future generations of dancers. Not just what had happened to Sylvia Hart, but why her story mattered to so many people who had never known her. She had become a symbol of the courage required to speak truth to power, and of the price that whistleblowers sometimes pay for their integrity. 20 years after her disappearance, Sylvia Hart was finally getting the justice she deserved, and the young dancers she had tried to protect were finally getting their voices heard. The discovery behind the mirror at the Green Hill Theater had done more than solve a cold case. It had opened a door that had been sealed shut for too long, allowing light to finally shine into the darkest corners of the dance world. But even as the legal process moved forward, questions remained about how many other victims there might have been, and how many other cases like Sylvia's might still be waiting to be uncovered. The culture change that her story had helped spark was just beginning, and the work of creating truly safe spaces for young artists would require ongoing vigilance and courage from an entire community. The renovation workers who made the discovery at the Green Hill Theater in 2002 could never have imagined the impact their findings would have. Behind that hastily constructed wall, sealed away for 20 years, they had found more than just evidence of a crime. They had found the key to understanding a tragedy that had been hidden in plain sight, and the catalyst for changes that would reverberate through the arts community for generations to come. Detective Chen stood in the renovated theater one last time before the trial began, looking at the space where the discovery had been made. The dressing room had been beautifully restored, its mirrors gleaming and its walls pristine. There was no visible sign of what had been hidden there for so many years, but Chen knew that the impact of that discovery would be felt long after. The physical evidence had been removed. The investigation had taken 3 years to complete, but Chen understood that, in many ways, it was just the beginning. The trial would bring Kellerman to justice, but the work of creating a culture where young artists could pursue their dreams without fear would require ongoing effort from everyone in the community. As Chen prepared to leave the theater, she thought about the young dancers who would perform on this stage in the years to come. They would never know the full story of what had happened here, but they would benefit from the changes that Sylvia Hart's courage had set in motion. Her death had not been in vain, and her legacy would live on in every young artist who was able to pursue their passion in safety and dignity. The discovery behind the mirror had revealed the truth about what happened to Sylvia Hart on that March night in 1982. But more importantly, it had revealed the truth about a system that had failed to protect vulnerable young people and the courage of one woman who had been willing to risk everything to change it. After 20 years of silence, Sylvia Hart's story was finally being told, and her voice was finally being heard. The Pointe shoes found behind the mirror were more than just evidence of a crime. They were a symbol of dreams deferred and lives cut short, but also of the power of truth to eventually triumph over even the most carefully constructed lies. The workers who had discovered them could never have imagined that they were uncovering not just the solution to a missing person case, but the key to understanding decades of systematic abuse and institutional failure. Those delicate satin shoes, found in their hidden space, would ultimately help bring justice to multiple victims and spark changes that would protect countless others. In the end, Sylvia Hart had gotten the justice she deserved, and the young dancers she had tried to protect had finally found their voices. The discovery at the Green Hill Theater had done more than solve a mystery. It had helped heal a community and ensure that the culture of silence that had enabled so much harm would never again go unchallenged.